3 years ago, I said this about the iPhone 14 Pro.
Yes, the iPhone 13 Pro was impressive. Yes, it had great dynamic range, and there was a lot of great processing going on. But anytime I zoomed into the images, I was always just like, okay, we're still not quite there yet. Well, that's different this year.
In that video, I took a deep dive looking at the new 48 megapixel sensor on the 14 Pro, and if you can't tell, I was completely blown away by the results. And it just so happens this year that the upgrade to the telephoto camera on the 17 Pro is a new, larger 48 megapixel sensor. I've been doing this for the past 5 years where I take the newest iPhone and compare it to my daily professional camera, the Canon R5, in real-world situations. The telephoto lens is not the only camera we got an upgrade to this year. We actually got an upgrade to the Selfie Cam, which we'll briefly take a look at as well. But the $1,100 question is, as a photographer, is the telephoto camera here a worthy upgrade, and will it impress me as much as it did 3 years ago? Is it a worthy upgrade if you had a phone from last year or the year previous? We're going to answer all of those questions in this video. So sit back, relax, put me out on the big screen, grab some popcorn, and enjoy the sights and sounds of the beautiful fall colors here in Colorado. All right, I got here right in time before this giant storm cloud came over and took some very dynamic shots that we're going to talk about in a second. But I want to explain what we're doing here first. As I said in the intro, the biggest upgrade this year is on that telephoto lens. On the 17 Pro, it is a 56% larger sensor than on the 16 Pro last year. We also moved to a 100mm lens rather than 120, but we keep the aperture of 2.8. Now, with a larger sensor and that same aperture, that means we should get better detail in our images, especially as the light gets less and less. To compare it, I'm going to be shooting with my Canon R5 and an RF 7200 f4. Now, like I said, the 16 Pro is at 120mm, so I'm not going to be able to do a apples to apples, pun intended, comparison. So I'm going to do my best to manipulate the images or crop in a little bit so that it's harder to tell which one is which. The biggest thing I'm curious about, though, is because we now have access to the 48 megapixel RAWs on the telephoto like we got access to last year on the ultra wide and previous years on the main camera, is can I zoom in 20% on this 100mm image and see if it's the same quality or better quality than the 120mm that are on the 16 Pro. The other thing is, if you've never watched any of my videos before, this is going to be a blind test. So I'm going to present all the cameras to you without you knowing which one is which. But they could change throughout the video. So for example, camera A might be the Canon R5 in this particular comparison, but it might be camera C in another comparison. Now I'm going to be shooting in RAW on all of my cameras on the Canon R5, and I'm going to be shooting in the RAW Max on both the 16 Pro and 17 Pro. That's going to give us access to those 48 megapixel images, and I'm going to be using the JPEG XL lossless compression, which if you want to know more details about that, you can check out my video from last year. Finally, I'm going to be using the built-in camera app on both phones. Now, I do recommend using something like today's sponsor, Reflex's app, for more controls over things like ISO, white balance, you get a histogram, and different things like that. But for this particular comparison, I want the least amount of variables possible. Now, in terms of our composition, it's an absolutely beautiful shot behind me, although now it's covered in rain, where I have these aspens on the left hand of the frame, I have snuffles on the right hand of the frame, and I've got some foliage and some contrasty dead trees in the foreground. The reason I really like this image to start off with is one thing I've noticed over the years is that on the 48 megapixel images from the iPhones is they do a really good job at rendering mountains and craggy peaks. And when I zoom in to 100% on those, they look really good. But where they tend to somewhat fall apart is in foliage, like on the trees behind me. Now we had lots of light. That probably means I need to wrap up filming this. But we had lots of light before, and that's going to give us the best possible results on the iPhones since they can keep their ISO very low. But I want to zoom in on that foliage and see how it renders on the 48 megapixel 17 Pro. Beautiful scene. Hopefully I don't get rained out. All right, so what better way to test out the new dual capture feature of the 17 Pro? Yeah, we got rained out. That was our scene was literally right there. That's the aspen trees kind of. And you can tell it is coming down out there, but looking back here, it's looking like some blue sky might happen shortly. So pretty excited. Gonna wait around and hope that it clears a little bit. Maybe we'll get a rainbow. Look at that! It's still raining, but my goodness. Holy crap. I feel like I should take a picture. And just like that, the sun came right back out. Probably took all of 10 minutes. Had to throw everything in the car, sit in it for 5 minutes, and then rush back out and set up this. And I got a nice shot, I think, as the clouds were peering over Sneffels. We're gonna end up picking out the best one. It may have been one of the earlier ones with that really dynamic light. There was like these little spotlights happening on the scene, and that one might be more interesting. Regardless, I'm gonna pick out my favorite, and I'm gonna show them to you now. Can you pick out which one is the Canon R5, the iPhone 16 Pro, or the iPhone 17 Pro? Another beautiful evening here in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. And if you've ever watched my iPhone comparison videos before, you might know what I'm about to test. And that's going to be the main sensor on the 17 Pro. Now, nothing changed this year. It's the same lens and sensor to our knowledge as the 14 Pro, the 15 Pro, and the 16 Pro. But I like to test it every year just to see if they've changed anything about the algorithms or how they're processing images. Now for this test, I'm only going to be comparing the 17 Pro to the camera. I'm not throwing in the old 16 Pro iPhone. And that is because I've taken this shot last year for this exact test. So you can see those images in an article linked down below. You can actually download some of those RAWs from throughout this video if you're interested in pixel peeping and be able to zoom in to see all of those details on all the images. And I'll include the RAWs from last year and possibly even the years before, so you can see if there's any differences. Now, I'm going to be taking two different shots. I've already taken one shot with the light filling the valley here, a lot of dynamics in that scene, a lot of highlights, a lot of shadows, and it's a test to see if both cameras can capture that large dynamic range in one image. Spoiler alert, they can. Like I said, I've already taken this shot multiple years, but it's always good to test. And in that shot, I'm using a polarizer on both cameras. I've got my Maven polarizers on my main camera, and I've got the reflex polarizers that are magnetic for the reflex case here, and it attaches directly to that. Super easy, super convenient. Now, the second shot I'm going to be doing is a blue hour shot. So I haven't taken it yet. I'm still waiting for the light to disappear. And a blue hour shot is really going to test the low light capabilities of the 17 Pro. And this is where we could actually see a difference from years past. And that is because even though the lens and the sensor hasn't changed, they could change the algorithms or how they're processing denoising or low light capabilities, or just the images in general. So that's what we're going to be putting to the test in a little bit once there is less light. And I want to answer a question that I get every year in the comments, and that is, why don't I control the ISO and shutter speed when I'm shooting with the iPhone? And while you can do that in apps and stuff, you cannot do that when you're shooting in the max raw setting with the 48 megapixels. The only thing I can do is press the shutter button. I cannot manually control any of those settings. Anyways, I'm gonna wait around, probably put on another jacket, and I'm gonna show those images to you now. Can you guess which is which? As you probably noticed throughout this video, I'm using a phone case on my new iPhone 17 Pro, and that is because I am not a psychopath like all the other reviewers here on YouTube who go caseless. This is the Carbon Pro case from Reflex, the sponsor of today's video. This is much more than just a phone case though. This is a gateway to a plethora of photography or videography accessories. The Reflex case lets you attach different lenses, such as their 240mm telephoto or their 2x telephoto lens. Take the 2x telephoto lens as an example. It attaches to the main sensor, effectively doubling the focal length while keeping the image quality of that fantastic main camera sensor that we just talked about. This allows you to capture a more natural shallow depth of field without loss of detail or resolution. The 240mm telephoto lens gives you that extra reach, but it can also be used as a fantastic macro lens with Reflex's macro add-ons. These add-ons snap right on the front of the telephoto lens and start letting you capture the smallest worlds in the biggest way possible. Along with a range of lens choices, Reflex also offers an entire filter lineup that can be attached to most of their lenses or right on the phone case like I did in the previous comparison. Choices like polarizers or black mist filters for photography and variable NDs for professional level videography. So, if you're itching to start photography as a hobby or simply want to explore more options with your phone, Reflex has so many fantastic choices to expand your creativity without needing to spend a bunch of money on a camera or lenses. Click the link in the description or scan this QR code that you can see on the screen now and grab yourself a case and a new lens and start capturing the world in more creative ways. One of the ways that I use my telephoto lens the most is actually with smaller, more intimate scenes like the one that you see behind me, rather than a big grand landscape. So I've come to one of my favorite aspen groves here in the San Juan Mountains. I've got this beautiful shot that you can see behind me lined up and composed with this center aspen tree where you can see all its leaves and surrounded by white aspen trunks. It's a really beautiful shot, but I will admit that I think if I was just shooting on my R5, that I would probably have to crop both the left and right framing out. But that's something that I would do regardless, maybe a square crop or something like that. That's something I'll know when I get to the edit. But just be aware that the image I end up presenting you will probably have some type of crop on it. Now, another thing is I've got the 17 Pro and the 16 Pro up here, and I'm using a 5-second timer on both of those and a 2-second timer on the R5 here so that no camera shake is induced. And I've tried to line up the composition as best as I possibly can because remember that this is 100 mil and this is 120 mil. And I'm taking two shots. You can see the scene behind me has a lot of white spots on the trees here. That is because the sun is still peering through and you're getting a lot of shadows and highlights. And it's going to be very difficult for these cameras to capture it all in the same image, but I want to see if it can. Now, that is giving more light to the iPhones, which is typically where they do best. So I'm actually also going to wait to hopefully when the sun goes behind a cloud or it sets enough that all the light on my scene back here will be even. Now, that's going to make it where it's far less dynamic. You don't have to have as much dynamic range or anything, but it's also going to probably require both the iPhones to maybe boost up their ISO a little bit and induce more noise in the image so that they can capture it. Now, the interesting thing is that the 17 Pro has a 56% larger sensor, as we've already talked about. So it should, in theory, be able to capture light easier and not have to boost up that ISO as high, meaning it should have less noise in the image when the scene doesn't have as much light on it. I'm gonna have to wait for some of that light to disappear. As you can see behind me, I'm gonna keep taking a few shots and present them to you, both one with this nice bright light and one with a more even light, and see if you can pick out which camera is which. this video is focused on photography. However, I couldn't make this and not talk about the new Selfie Cam, even though I don't typically use it for photography. So this entire section is actually going to be filmed using just the Selfie Cam. I'm just using the Apple camera app. I'm not using Log or Blackmagic or anything like that, or HDR, just 24 FPS right in the camera app. And you can actually see it working right now. So you can tell there's like this little halo coming around me to brighten up my face while also darkening the background here. That is the kind of thing that it does automatically, which can be pretty nice, especially for filming vlogs, which is why I wanted to film this, to show you what this will look like if you end up filming a vlog. Now, the sensor has been improved. It is now a 18 megapixel square sensor. Sophie and I took a few selfies on the 16 Pro and the 17 Pro. They were not scientific, but when I zoomed into both of them, the detail is roughly the same. Where it does improve though, is that you can take landscape images, whether you're in portrait or landscape. So you get the best of both worlds, regardless of how you're holding the camera. It also means when you're filming vlogs like this one, that I can actually not change the camera, hit pause or hit stop, hit a button, and it'll go into vertical orientation for things like your TikToks and your Reels and stuff like that without having to change the camera. Now, something we don't have access to is open gate, meaning right now there's actually more stuff on the top and the bottom of the frame that I could be filming, which would be super nice because then I could turn it into vertical or landscape regardless of what I'm filming, but Apple has not given us access to that. The last thing they've added is that if you're using center stage, which is that thing where it'll follow you around and zoom into your face, and if someone else comes into the frame, it'll add them to the image because there's more real estate to work with, even if you don't know them, which is something that I experienced a couple times in testing this. Was people would walk by and my frame would get bigger and smaller and bigger. It's kind of funny. But those are the improvements. In my experience, it's mostly a convenience thing, so you don't have to keep turning your phone. Sometimes it's easier to hold your phone in portrait when you want to take a big landscape like the one you see behind me. That is the Selfie Cam. We got through it without any wind. Let's move on to the next thing. I'm calling that a success. All right, so now that we've taken all the images, it is time to reveal which ones were which and also get to peeping a couple pixels. Now for this whole thing, I'm going to be filming on my Canon R7 and the 17 Pro, just right in the camera app. No special sauce going on. All I have is HDR turned off, so you can see the difference between the two if this is something you would ever want to use it for. Okay, so for the results for that first big grand landscape, camera A was the 17 Pro, camera B was the R5, and camera C was the 16 Pro. Now for all of these, we're going to compare the 17 Pro to the R5 first, and then we'll take a look at the 17 Pro versus the 16 Pro. Now, you're going to see this image that's on the screen, and you're going to go, that's not the image that I was presented during the video. And that is because, remember, I had to crop these in by about 20% to match the 16 Pro for the blind test. So for this comparison, as we look at the pixels, I just reset the crop on both of these because I actually think this composition is much stronger. It's the composition that I found out in the field and the one I prefer, but we still had to crop in so we could do the blind test. And on the left, you're going to notice that the 17 Pro looks a little bit larger than the R5, and that is because when it takes images, they're in 4:3 ratio, whereas the R5 is in 2:3 ratio, so you get a little bit less on the top and bottom. So the first thing we're going to do is let's zoom in right here to the craggy peaks, because if you remember in the video, I was saying that typically that quad Bayer sensor that we've had experience with on both the 16 Pro and the 14 Pro when they released it renders mountain areas really well. Now, once we zoom in, you're going to notice right off the bat that the 17 Pro is not rendering the mountains nearly as good as the Canon R5. You might be saying, well, isn't that to be expected? But keep an open mind and remember to look at the craggy peaks on the next comparison when we look at the main sensor. Now, something that I thought could be causing this is that the depth of field is too shallow on the 17 Pro. On the Canon R5, if you remember, I'm shooting at f8 at 100mm on that full frame sensor, and we're only shooting at f2.8 on the iPhone. However, once you do equivalence calculations, which is definitely out of the scope of this video, the depth of field on the iPhone should actually be less shallow than on the full frame R5 at f8. So I do not think it's a depth of field issue. I just think that it's not rendering that mountain as pristine as I would expect it to based off of the results that I got from the main camera sensor a few years ago. All right, so now that we've taken a look at those craggy peaks, let's look at the foliage, which is typically where the quad Bayer sensor tends to struggle, especially in lower light, something we're going to talk about a little bit later in our comparisons. So if you zoom in at 100% here, this is actually where I was surprised by the 17 Pro's results. Yes, it's not as strong as the R5, it's not as sharp, it's not as detailed, but there's more here than I expected. This is something that I've experienced in the past where that quad Bayer sensor just has difficulty when it comes to the very small details like foliage. Unlike something like these craggy peaks where it can kind of figure out what it's supposed to look like and it can do its processing and usually does a better job at rendering those spots, it has a much harder time with leaves and trees and bushes and stuff like that. But these results are actually better than I expected. I will say that they're definitely not what the R5 is producing, which I'm sure you can tell on your screen, but I'm still pretty impressed by these results coming from a phone. Okay, so now taking a look at the 17 Pro versus 16 Pro, I've gone ahead and reset the crop on the 17 Pro so that they're matching. And let's just zoom in to 100% here. Now, you're gonna notice I'm far more zoomed in on the 17 Pro image, and that is because it's 48 megapixels. So what I have to do is I have to unlock this. I have to, let's just get it to an even number here, put it at 100%, click on this one and put this one at 200%. And now the images should be roughly matching. We're zoomed into 200% on the 12 megapixel 16 Pro image, and we're zoomed into 100% on the 17 Pro. And you're gonna see that there is not a whole lot of difference between these two images. Yes, the 16 Pro looks over sharpened, and we looked a bit too zoomed in, and there are more details in the 17 Pro, but I bet you're not gonna notice a huge difference here on YouTube. Now remember, you can download these for yourself in the link in the description if you're interested in seeing it without compression, but just take my word for it. My eyes say that the 17 Pro image does have slightly more detail, but it's not like the main camera sensor was a few years ago and how big of a difference that was. Same with the ultra wide, which is, you're gonna notice that the telephoto comparison this year is very similar to the ultra wide comparison last year. Now, before we move on to the next comparison, taking a look at the foliage on the 17 Pro versus 16 Pro, there is more detail in the 17 Pro here. I actually like the way that it looks in this particular scene way better in the 17 Pro than the 16 Pro. And on the 16 Pro, you're gonna see artifacting, you're gonna see it looks over sharpened and a loss of detail in the trees. And we definitely have a more of a painterly feel on the 17 Pro. Something very interesting here is if I hadn't seen the R5 image and I just saw the 17 Pro image, I would think it's pretty good until I looked at what shooting the image looks like on my R5. But for the most part, there is an improvement here on the 17 Pro for now. Stay tuned because you're gonna see something that goes against this that was the exact same thing that happened last year in the ultra wide test when we get to low light capabilities. But before we do that, let's take a look at the main sensor test of the 17 Pro versus the R5. For the daylight test, camera A was the R5 and camera B was the 17 Pro. And for the low light test, camera A was the 17 Pro and camera B was the R5. Now, let's just start off right in the details. Remember how I said that on that main camera sensor 3 years ago on the 14 Pro, I was blown away by how it was able to render mountains, craggy peaks, and those details in comparison to my R5. So even at 200% here, 17 Pro on the left, Canon R5 on the right, you can see that the details are pretty strong in both images. It's obviously the 17 Pro is just a little bit less sharp, a little bit less detailed, but for the most part, this still blows me away. This result on this main camera sensor is still very impressive to me. You can still see all the little trees in the 17 Pro. You can see all the shadows, all the craggy peaks, all the snow in the shadowy areas. And this is always something that it's done very well over the last 3 years. Now, if we zoom out and go back to some of the foliage, again, where it tends to fall off, this year, I think it actually does a pretty good job when there's enough light presented. It captures a good amount of detail in the areas where the light is, but as soon as you move to the shadows, pay attention to the shadows on the 17 Pro area versus the shadows on the R5 area, and that is typically where you start to lose detail. You'd notice back here that just starts to turn to mush, and that is just what happens on that quad Bayer sensor. Overall, this comparison is roughly the same as it has been the last couple of years. Still a very strong argument to be made on the 17 Pro, but I don't necessarily think it's any better than past year's main sensor cameras. All right, so moving on to the low light test on the main sensor, this is actually where we could see an upgrade just because of the computational stuff that Apple is doing on the phone can be upgraded or changed year over year. On the left, we have the 17 Pro. On the right, we have the R5, and you're gonna see that these are pretty comparable. Not as close as when we shot this in daylight, but I do think that the 17 Pro is doing still a pretty good job here on the peaks. We can still see all the individual trees, but we definitely get less detail in this hillside here where the trees start to blend together, just as expected. Now, where it tends to fall off is in the foliage. So if we go right here to the trees, you're gonna notice that the details here definitely get pretty mushy. However, I will say, now this is subjective because I'm not comparing it year over year, or I don't have them next to each other and the conditions may have been different. I do think that it's doing a better job in some of these areas where there is less light than I remember on the 14 Pro. So again, I will include those in the link in the description if you want to take a look yourself. I remember those areas being extremely mushy. And you can actually see that if you move to this foliage back here with the trees. Just pay attention to the green areas on the R5. You get all the details there, and it just kind of just turns to mush on the 17 Pro. That's been my experience year over year, but I do think that it looks slightly better on the 17 Pro this year than what I remember of doing this exact comparison in this exact location on the 14 Pro 3 years ago. But that is subjective, so you know, your mileage may vary with those results. All right, so moving on to those aspen trees in both daylight and low light. For the daylight shot, camera A was the R5, camera B was the 16 Pro, and camera C was the 17 Pro. And on the low light test, camera A was the R5, camera B was the 16 Pro, and camera C was the 17 Pro. They're identical. I didn't mix them up. So let's take a look here. We got the 17 Pro on the left and the R5 on the right. Now, these are cropped in. Let me give you a really quick example of how cropped in they are. However, this is likely a rough crop that I would do regardless of how I shot this image. So I'm actually not going to compare the R5 and 17 Pro uncropped because this is roughly the crop that I would use for my actual images that I would end up posting. Let's zoom into 100% on the foliage. Now, I'm actually pretty impressed with the results of the 17 Pro here because typically foliage is where it falls off. However, this foliage is much more pronounced and larger in the scene than it typically is on something like the main camera or on the previous image where it was pretty far away and pretty small in terms of the scene. It's doing a pretty good job at noticing the highlights and how it's handling shadows. And something I have to mention and give credit to is that the dynamic range on all of the sensors on this Apple phones is phenomenal. Like, it gives you so much detail to work with. It's very similar to something I would expect on my bigger professional cameras. But it's really about the details and how it's handling both the foliage areas and the details of the image that we're really paying attention to now, because I've come to expect the dynamic range to be pretty strong on all the cameras. Something else I want to mention is I always edit the R5 image first, and then I edit the phone images to try to match it. That seems the most genuine, and it wouldn't make a lot of sense for me to edit the phone images and just see if the R5 can match it, because it obviously can. So moving through the details here, something to really pay attention to is in these shadow areas. Now, obviously there is more detail on the R5 image, but I'm still impressed that we're not getting that mushiness in the shadow areas like we were previously, but stick around, you're gonna see that that's gonna change soon. Overall, I think that the 17 Pro is doing an okay job here. It's not as apples to apples as it is on the main sensor when I have a daylight shot like we saw before, but it's still doing a decent job and it's handling those details pretty well. However, where it might fall apart here is when we're comparing the 17 Pro to the 16 Pro. Even though I was impressed by the 17 Pro's rendition of that foliage, it's really looking at the 16 Pro that maybe I shouldn't be as impressed. So let's zoom into 100% here, or 150%. I'm gonna unlock this, and let's just get both at the same zoom rates. Remember, I gotta put 200% on that 12 megapixel image and 100% on the other one so that they are matched. And now they should be pretty close. And I'm just gonna let this sit on the screen for a little bit because I have a feeling you're not gonna notice a whole lot of difference. Yes, there is some sharpening and artifacts going on in the 16 Pro, because again, we're only working with 12 megapixels, we're zooming into 200%, and there is more detail on the 17 Pro, but not by much. It is very minimal. I was actually surprised here seeing how well the 16 Pro rendered the same foliage areas on that sensor and that lens as the 17 Pro, even though we moved up to a larger sensor with more megapixels. So let's take a look at the low light image of the 17 Pro versus 16 Pro. We're gonna skip the R5 for just a second because I think this is probably the most important thing in this entire video. So let's zoom into the same exact area here, 100% here, 200% here. I'm just gonna let these images sit on the screen for just a second and you get to pick out which one looks better than the other. Okay, that was 3 seconds. I have a feeling that you probably came to the same conclusion I did, and that the 16 Pro image actually looks better than the 17 Pro. And where you can really notice it is, let's move right over here. Notice how much more detailed the leaves are here than they are up here. It almost looks like the leaves on the 17 Pro were blowing in the wind. And I can tell you right now, they were not. It's one of the calmest days I've ever had up there shooting these aspens. The leaves were not blowing at all, pretty much. This blurriness is coming from that quad Bayer sensor technology. And this is the same exact thing I noticed last year in the ultra-wide test. I just didn't know what was happening until I started to see this repeated pattern. And the reason this is happening is because the sensor on the iPhone, and all of them, when it says it's 48 megapixels, it's not really 48 megapixels. It's actually 12 megapixels, and then it's taking 4 images, I believe. Don't quote me on this. I don't know the exact science behind it, but I believe it's taking multiple images and combining them together computationally and trying to render more detail at the exact moment that you hit the shutter. But because there's lower light here, it struggles with those foliage details, and it's why it always does worse in the darker parts of the scene. And the reason that the 16 Pro looks better here is because it's snapping one image. It's not snapping multiple images at once and trying to combine them together and then computationally blending them. And that is the reason that you see some of the mushiness here in the leaves, almost like they were blowing, because it's taking multiple images, trying to combine them together, and it's definitely missing the mark there on the foliage. So to me, this is a pretty obvious fallback of those sensors, even though it's technically giving us more megapixels, especially when they can put it on a stat sheet, but it's not necessarily improving the image quality here, just like last year on the ultra-wide camera. All right, so just for completion's sake, let's take a look at the 17 Pro versus the R5. Although you've already seen the 17 Pro image, you already know my conclusion. It lacks detail in the leaves there, especially when it's trying to render those things at lower light, and there's far more detail in the R5 image. Ironically, if I click on the 16 Pro image, even though we're not zoomed into 200% or enough on it, you can clearly see there's more detail in the 16 Pro image of the leaves than on the 17 Pro image here, which we've already talked about. R5 obviously handles the image just like you would expect. 17 Pro definitely leaves more to be desired. All right, so my conclusion this year is twofold. If you're a photographer looking to upgrade to the 17 Pro for that new telephoto lens or sensor, I would hold off. However, if you are on a phone that's about 4 years old, like the 13 Pro or before, upgrading is going to give you a new sensor and capabilities on all the cameras, and that would be a significant upgrade. However, if you're on like the 15 Pro or the 16 Pro, and you just might want the telephoto upgrade, I don't think it's worth it. Actually, if you're on the 15 Pro and you would get the ultra-wide upgrade and the telephoto upgrade, I still don't think it's worth it. What is worth it though, is if you are someone that uses the Selfie Cam a lot, specifically for filming something like a vlog. I actually think the Selfie Cam is probably the most significant upgrade in terms of the cameras this year, or at least the camera results. And if you're someone that finds yourself vlogging or filming, whether it's vertical or horizontal content, I actually think that that's the most significant upgrade, especially if you're using it in a professional sense. On this channel in the past and even to today, I sometimes use my phone to vlog in a pinch. So I think that that's probably the biggest upgrade this year when it comes to photography. One other thing I wanted to touch base on is last year, I reserved judgment on the camera control button and didn't really speak of it because I hadn't used it enough. Well, we're about a year later, and I could probably say the same exact thing. I haven't used it enough. I have tried to use it. I definitely tried to use it and when Sophia and I went head to head in the 16 Pro versus her Fujifilm. But most of the time I end up finding myself hitting the button when I don't want to hit the button. And when I'm taking images, I tend to use the volume down button to use as the shutter, specifically because I can actually feel it when I press it, unlike that haptic feedback button for the camera control. I also find myself accidentally adjusting settings on it when I don't mean to, or I accidentally half press it and then it brings up settings rather than taking the photo. And overall, maybe that's just a me thing. I would actually love to know what you guys think in the comments that have had the camera control button. Do you use it? I find myself just either tapping the screen or pressing the volume down button. Anyways, that concludes this year's video on the 17 Pro. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. It takes me an absurd amount of time to go out and film and shoot all of these scenes and put together this video. So it would mean the world to me if you hit the like button if you've made it this far. And consider subscribing. I've got a video I think I want to make on the way where I take the 17 Pro out and compare it to something like one of my Nikons or Fujis and try to take images straight out of the camera and see what we can come up with in terms of the phone's capabilities. Anyways, thank you for watching. There's got to be a rainbow out there somewhere. We just got to go find them. Later.